All right, let's get started. So the whole live office hour for a ProjectWise webinar is really the common themes to help users working from home. And today we're at here, the session 6, configuration to optimize the user performance. Please stay tuned for tomorrow's session and also the next week's session. So my colleagues, they're going to deliver all these very interesting topics. And also we made some adjustments for the sessions targeting for Asia Pacific. Please feel free to distribute all these new days to your colleagues in that region. If you miss any sessions, you can always watch the recording on Facebook or YouTube. On Facebook, you can just follow ProjectWise and you can click on this link. So it will take you to the YouTube playlist. Before we start, I just want to talk a little bit about today's session. So today's session, the target audience is really focused on the ProjectWise admins or anyone who's interested in ProjectWise administrations. So today we're going to talk about how to configure user settings, network settings, file streaming, and Audit Trail to optimize the user performance, especially within the context of everyone working from home. As always, you can click on this link to as a good reference. You will be able to find a lot of very useful information within this web page. All right, let's start it from the user settings within ProjectWise datasource. A lot of organizations, they apply the working directory settings pointing to some network drive. Really from management's perspective, again, it's not a problem within the office environment. But with everyone working from home, obviously it's not a very good option. So we really want to minimize the bandwidth it consumed within the VPN from the end users' machines. So in this context, we'll be working from home to the network drive would be in the office, some servers in the office. Really the best bet within the current situation will be pointing to the working directory to a local hard drive on the local PCs rather than to any network drive. I think for this one is really straightforward. It's part of the user setting within the ProjectWise admin. The other thing I want to highlight would be we need to turn on two options within the user settings. One is to leave local copy on check-in. The other one is use up-to-date local copy on checkout. So really, as I think it's quite descriptive. So whenever a user check back in a document, the up-to-date local copy is still sitting inside the working directory. So for the next time, when a user check out the same document, the system, ProjectWise system, is going to look into to see whether you already have up-to-date copy under your working directory. If the answer is yes, in that case, you don't have to download that document again from the system. So given those two options both turned on, it will really helpful, especially for the users working from home, so we don't have to download the same document again and again. So for those two user settings, I think it's pretty straightforward. So now the question is, how can I apply the change to all the existing users and to any new potential new users? Really, for new users, all we need to do is to change the default user settings. Within ProjectWise admin, the default user settings really means if you, within ProjectWise data source, if you click on users and go to properties, whatever you do here would be the default user settings. So any changes you make here, as we specified the user settings about a working directory, and also for the document we just talked about moments ago, leave local copy on check-in, and use up-to-date local copy on checkout. Whenever any changes you make here will be the default user setting. For any new users created from after this point, we'll inherit all these user settings by default. So you make that change to the default user settings, any new users, you don't have to worry about it. So now the question is, I have a lot of existing users. If I want to make a change, how do I apply that change to existing users? Essentially, you have two options. You can change the user settings manually by selecting multiple users. So now it really depends on how many users you're managing. In my past experience, whenever you are trying to change the user setting for thousands of the users, it may take a very long time. So essentially, you can select all the users and go to properties. In this case, it may take a very long time for you to make any change here. But essentially, uh, if you are managing a small number of the users, in that case, you can select all these users and then changing whatever settings here. It will apply this change to all the users you selected here. Again, as I said, it really depends on your situation. If you're only dealing with up to hundreds of the users, you can select them manually and then apply the change. The other scenario really is if you are familiar with the ProjectWise PowerShell command list. So essentially, Bentley provides a number of the ProjectWise PowerShell command lists. Using those command lists, you will be able to access ProjectWise data, very similar to the ProjectWise APIs. But the difference is if you are familiar with the PowerShell, so by running all these command lists, it's much easier than the ProjectWise APIs because you have to be a C++ programmer. Um, using this command list could be very dynamic. So you don't have to select all these users, go to property settings, and then waiting a very long time, and then apply whatever changes. So using the command list, you can run those command lists, whenever you need to, because you don't have to wait there to work on all these things proactively. Running the command list, you can maybe before you go home or you finish today's work, you can start running that PowerShell so it will make that change overnight. Again, if you are not familiar with the ProjectWise PowerShell command list, you can follow this link. That will be our starting point. Very quickly, so the user settings will be the first thing I would suggest all the ProjectWise admins to tackle in the first place. It will directly affect the performance for all your end users. So let's move on to look at the data source settings. So for the data source settings, I want to break down into different sections. Let's have a look on the network settings first. If I go into my data source and I go to properties, I can go to settings, and let's have a quick look on the network settings first. So the first one is the data file transfer. It determines how you are going to transfer physical files between ProjectWise servers and the ProjectWise client over the network. By default, this option is turned on. Instead of whenever this option is on, instead of transferring the whole file, it only transfers the portion which has changed. Regardless, your network is high latency or low latency, it's always beneficial to turn this option on. The second one is client server request data. So it basically determines how we're going to transfer the data between ProjectWise client and the ProjectWise database server. If your ProjectWise environment is hosted on-prem, in that case, you might not turn this option on because it's a low latency, high bandwidth on the local area network. In that case, turn this option on may slow you down in a sense because what's given this option turned on, what's going to happen is before the client send any data into the ProjectWise database server, it's going to compress the data. And then on the ProjectWise DB end, it's going to decompress first and then receive it. Receive it first and then decompress it. In that case, it may taking longer within the office environment. So given everybody working from home now, you might consider turn this option on because for the end users, it's quite different from the office environment. Maybe you're dealing with high latency and low bandwidth situation. In that case, you might consider turn this option on. I would suggest maybe if you have a test environment, you can run some benchmark testing first to make sure this option is really helping, improving the performance. Again, I would suggest run your test first, and then you can decide on whether or not you want to make this change. The last one is really called file transfer connection sharing. So given this option on, it's going to reduce the overheads while transferring a large number of the documents, especially whenever you are using managed workspace. That basically means you are transferring a large number of the documents. In this case, it's strongly recommended to turn this option on if you are using managed workspace. Again, it really depends on your own situation. I would suggest you definitely consider the data file transfer. And if you are using managed workspace, I would strongly recommend you turn on enable file transfer connection sharing. Depends on your situation to accommodate everybody working from home. I also recommend you to turn on the compress the request data option. So that's the first section about the data source settings. It's really about the network settings. The second one is really about the file streaming. So now I just want to emphasize first, the file streaming is only applicable for MacStation and MacStation based applications. It does not work for AutoCAD or any AutoCAD based applications. So how file streaming works is whenever you're dealing with a point cloud or high density raster images, you're dealing with humongous files. It could be we're talking about gigabytes data. Instead of downloading the whole file, given the file streaming option turned on, you only download the portion to fit the MacStation view. In that case, we don't have to download the whole file, the whole gigabytes data across over the network. So within your organization, if you do have this use case, so a lot of users working from home, they still need to work on the point cloud, or they still need to referencing in the raster images. In that case, I would recommend you consider adopting this option. If you want to enable file streaming in your data source, it's a two-step process. So first, you need to enable streaming on the server level. So namely, you need to edit the DMS kernel.cfg on the integration server. Essentially, you just need to find those two lines and then uncomment out those two lines. Once you're doing that, you also need to enable streaming per data source. So how many data sources within on that specific integration server, you need to apply, you need to enable file streaming within every single data source on that integration server. So it's pretty straightforward. All you need to do is to say, I want to enable streaming for point cloud, and also you can specify the minimum size to to quantify to enable the streaming for that file type. The minimum you can go would be 2 megabytes. In my personal opinion, maybe 2 megabytes is too small. Maybe you can download the whole file. It may not be a big deal. But again, I would recommend you can play around with this minimum file size to as the benchmark data. So to see, how big a difference it can make. Maybe you can starting from 5 megabytes or maybe from 10. It's really up to your environment. But to recap, the very first thing I think if you need to keep in mind is it's only applicable for MacStation and MacStation based applications. The second part is really whenever you decided to enable this feature, it's a two-step process, both on the server level and also on the data source level. And lastly, let's talk about Audit Trail. So first of all, why the number of the Audit Trail records matters is because a lot of ProjectWise user actions will query the Audit Trail table first. And if you have a huge number of the Audit Trail table records within the Audit Trail table. So whenever you check out the document, if you want to work on a document with a managed workspace, it may waiting a very long time. We're talking about minutes. So in that case, maybe it's not a huge deal within the office environment, but now everybody working from home, it could be a huge deal because the communication between the user's home into your ProjectWise database server, the latency may not be great. The bandwidth may be very low. In that case, really the Audit Trail table records, the number of the Audit Trail table records could play a big factor with the user performance. Really to optimize Audit Trail settings, so we can looking from two perspectives. So the first part would be to look what actions we want to log. So every actions you decide to log will end up new records into the Audit Trail table. And also for the retention settings, it really depends on your retention policy within your organization. So I would recommend before you do anything, talk to your legal department within your organization to find out what your retention policy is. If you're an engineering firm and you're running a project for a specific client, maybe you will specify certain legal obligations on what kind of records you need to keep for how long. So before you do anything, talk to your legal department to find out what exactly, contractually, you need to keep how long of the records. Again, on the technical side, if you go into ProjectWise data source settings, we have a specific tab called Audit Trail. And if you click on settings, so you will be able to see, for example, for all the documents, here's all these actions you can log. Again, by confirming with your legal department, in that case, you can decide on which actions I want to log for document, for folders, and so on and on. And also, depending on your retention policy, you can decide on how long you want to keep your records, maybe 6 years or 6 months. In this case, it will be your starting point. Based upon your policy, you can define exactly what actions you want to log and how long you want to keep the records. You might ask, let's say if I say my retention policy is 6 years, we need to keep all the records within the past 6 years. What happens if I have records older than 6 years? In that case, it moves on to the second part, is really whether or not you specify the secondary table. So let's say if you set the retention policy to say, I want to keep the records for 6 years, and without specifying any secondary table, what it basically means, any records older than 6 years will be deleted permanently. So whenever you setting up your retention policies, you have to keep in mind that's what's going to happen. So that's very important. Once a record has been deleted permanently, it will be harder to retrieve. So the only way to retrieve all these deleted records will be going through the backup of your ProjectWise datasource DB. Obviously, it's not that easy. So before you do anything, please consider that. So if you do specify the secondary table, what's going to happen is any records older than the retention settings will be moved from the primary audit trail table to the secondary audit trail table. In that case, you're not going to lose anything. It's just the system is going to automatically what is so-called truncate the records from the primary table into the secondary table. So that's the next slide, what it basically says. If you do specify the secondary table, we're going to, ProjectWise, the system is going to move all these records automatically for you. It's just before you do anything about Audit Trail records, it's just a few basics I really hope as a takeaway you need to keep in mind. So first, whenever you enable the secondary table, so for the first migration, for the first truncation, I would strongly recommend you do the first truncation, find a long weekend to do so. It really depends on how many records you are truncating from the primary table to the secondary table. It can take days. So in that case, find a long weekend, because if you enable the truncation during the weekdays, and it may drastically slow down the performance of the ProjectWise database. And as a result, it's going to slow everybody down. So you better find a weekend to do so. If the truncation fails for whatever reason, so ProjectWise will not delete any unremoved records. So all the records, it fails in the middle, so all the other records will stay in the primary table. The second point is also very important as well. You cannot directly access the secondary audit trail table by using ProjectWise Explorer. Basically means within ProjectWise Explorer, normally you go to a folder, you go to a document, go to the audit properties, audit trail tab. You can see all these audit trail records. It's only going to show the audit trail records within the primary audit trail table. It's not going to show any records from the secondary audit trail table. So in that case, you can't run the ProjectWise Explorer directly to view the secondary audit trail table, but still you can run any DB tools to query the secondary audit trail table. If you really want to see to enable ProjectWise Explorer to view both primary and secondary audit trail table, I do know our Bentley professional services, they have a special add-in. So you can contact Bentley. So our professional services might be able to help you out to provide the special add-in to the ProjectWise Explorer. Again, it really depends on which version you are running, and also you need to install that add-in on top of the ProjectWise Explorer. But the possibility is there if you consider, to consider that as special customization. Feel free to contact Bentley about that. So the last point, as I already said, if you set the retention settings, but without specifying the secondary table, what's going to happen is all the records older than the retention period of time will be deleted permanently. So that will be something always keep in mind. All right, that's everything I want to talk about today.